Welcome back, everybody, to Photography Tips and Tricks, your show for gear tips, inspiration, anything you need to get your photography over to the next level. My name is RC, and this week I wanted to answer a little bit of viewer mail that talks about NEF and RAW, or RAW and JPEG. Now, Nick Rodriguez watches, right? He says he watches the program from England and he loves the show. Nick, thank you so much for watching. I have a question for you. Am it best to shoot in JPEG or in NEF RAW so that I can produce better photographs quality for the intention of printing? Now, Nick, probably one of the biggest things that you might want to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of stuff is the entire concept of exposure and color and what kinds of things you lose when you're going from a JPEG to a RAW. So exposure is key. When you take a shot, if you take a well-exposed shot, you could be pretty good with JPEG. I bring this example up. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. This is a shot that I shot in Dubai with a Fuji X-T1. Nicely exposed shot, right? No camera work needed. If you take a look, lots of detail, right? Lots of skin, great skin tone handling. A lot of the times I think JPEGs get a bad rap, right? A lot of them are like, well, JPEGs aren't as good as RAW. Not necessarily. Remember, these cameras have built-in computers to process these JPEGs. Fuji, Canon, Sony, Nikon, all of these cameras will do very well with a JPEG provided that it's exposed properly and provided that you like the look that comes out of the camera. So the things that you are going to see are color, contrast, sharpening. Keep that in mind. If it's exposed, that's good. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the RAW is going to be better. It just means that you might have to do a little bit of work into it. Now, I'll take a look here inside of Lightroom. We'll get and show you two shots. So I have one shot here. I have another shot here. This is the RAW, this is the JPEG. Now, I shot with the X-T1 in JPEG mode, RAW plus JPEG, because I wanted to be able to shoot at a 16:9 format. I think it's kind of cool when I'm out sometimes. I just set it to 16:9. I like shooting in that crop mode and I'm looking around. It makes it good for composition. And every now and again, I'm like, oh, you know what? I'll actually just use the JPEG with this. It looks pretty good. But here we're shooting, right, 200th of a second, 10mm f/22 at a 200 ISO, 10mm f/22 at around a 1/7 of a second. This is the shot that came out as a JPEG. To the right of it, same shot came out as a RAW file. Now, obviously this one's bigger because it's not cropped. The crop for the JPEG happened in the camera. So you'll see that right off the bat, this has a little bit more contrast. It has a little bit more color applied because I shot this with a profile setup. Inside of the Fuji, I had the option to use Velvia, so I was using Velvia for it, which is going to be a little bit more saturated, a little bit more yellowy. For that, good here, not here. One of the things that I didn't like here is you see how all of this stuff here in this area feels a little blocked up, right? It's a little dark. So if I wanted to compensate for that, I would go under my basic slider and I would just bring my shadows up a little bit. I could bring my highlights down a little bit to be able to correct for the picture. Not bad. A very small adjustment like this could be good. But as you start pushing this further and further, you will introduce some noise and you will not be able to zoom in as much on something. So this right here, having to push all of this, will get a little noisy. Not necessarily the thing that I would want to see in this file. By comparison, if I go over to my RAW file, I have a lot more detail to work with. Right? So the file's much bigger, and I feel you have a little bit more latitude in working with this. I'm just going to make some adjustments here. I think this looks a little bit more, or a little bit better. I can increase some vibrance to bring in some of that color tone. It's still not as contrasty as you would see here, but I feel like this file will start breaking apart when you start doing a little bit more pushing and pulling. That's where exposure is key. Now, this brings you to a situation where you have to say to yourself, Nick, when I want to print, do I like the color treatment that the camera gives you right out of the camera? If you need that, then what you need are color profiles. Any RAW file that you throw inside of Lightroom, let's say Canon, Sony, Fuji, a lot of other manufacturers, that will depend on whether or not they have it or not. You go down to the camera calibration section. I'm going to use the RAW file, I'm going to go to camera calibration, and inside of here on the profile, you'll see that it's set to Adobe Standard. Click on the drop down, and you have a bunch of different profiles for, in this case, the Fuji camera. What I like about it, they give you Provia, Velvia, Astia, Proneg, Proneg Standard, and a whole bunch of monochromes. So I go to the Velvia. That applies a similar color saturation that you would see here. So now you have all of the benefits of using the camera in a RAW, and you have all of the benefits by applying the color profile onto the file. Canon will do the same thing, Nikon will do the same thing. Canons will only see Canons, Nikons will only see Nikons, Fujis will only see Fujis. So that will deal with your color. The other thing that you might want to deal with is sharpening. This picture that you have here is a JPEG file, has sharpening applied to it. That's sharpening that's been done inside of the camera. The RAW file will not have that sharpening applied. So you'll have to go over here under the detail slider and add some sharpening to it. That will give you a little bit more oomph out of this. How much this is going to be to taste, and this is the subject of a ton of different conversations of how to be able to do it. So sharpening is something that you're going to need to do. If you need to adjust white balance, you won't be able to do it on your JPEG, auto or custom. That's all you get. You go to the RAW file. The RAW file will let you use a bunch of different options. By switching to daylight, it kind of gives me a little bit more. So those are the considerations. Obviously, RAW is a little bit bigger, right? So if you have a smaller card, that's not necessarily something that you might want to do. But JPEG gets a bad rap, and I think that JPEG could be done and can be done well, but you have to keep in mind exposure. You have to keep in mind how much color you're using. You might have to finagle the color inside of the camera, and contrast. You want to keep that in mind. But either one of them could do okay. I'd still side with a RAW file. Use the color profiles, add sharpening, and you're going to be good to go. But that solves nothing about the print. When you want to do a print, you've got to keep in mind a couple of different things, and we'll talk about those things when we get back. Welcome back, everybody. Photography Tips and Tricks RC here. This is a special viewer mail for Nick Rodriguez out in the UK. Now, we were talking about JPEGs versus RAW for printing, and I told you kind of my preference for most of this stuff. I like to shoot RAW, I'll apply a color profile, make sure that you add a little bit of sharpness to the file, right? Color, contrast, detail are things that you're going to lose, or not lose, but things that you're going to have to consider when you're adding to a RAW file. So we've talked about that, but there's also a printing component to it. On the print component, I kind of tend to do things a little bit differently. Now, this is just my way of doing it. What I would do with a file for printing is I tend to bring it into Photoshop. When I bring this file into Photoshop, I use a plugin. Now, you can do sharpening a variety of different ways. You could go back into Camera Raw and you could add detail that way using the detail slider. You could use, filter, sharpen, and on the sharpen, you could do unsharp mask for detail. For me, what I tend to like to do with this is usually on the RAW side, before I even start the process, when I'm doing all of this stuff here, I'll tend to skip the detail slider here entirely. I'll bring the file into Photoshop, and in Photoshop, I'll tend to go to Filter, Nick Collection, and I use Sharpener Pro Raw Pre-Sharpener. For me, it just tends to work a little bit better. So inside of here, I'll grab this. What I like about this is that the sliders are pretty straightforward, right? You come over here and you just adaptive sharpening. You want to sharpen areas or edges, just the very edges. Once I have that all set, and this is something that you would largely do to taste. This is the file, this is the raw sharpening that's done at the very beginning. There's two types of raw. There's pre-capture sharpening and post-capture sharpening. Pre-capture basically means this is the sharpening that you would have should you have shot this in JPEG, right? Camera doesn't do any sharpening for you in RAW. You've got to add stuff that the camera would have done. Once this is done, and this is the key, Nick, when you do this, you want to do output sharpening. You want to put sharpening out to the printer. To do that, again, you could use all of the other ones, unsharp mask and the detail slider and all that. For me, I tend to go very easy for me. I tend to use my plugin. Inside of here, Nick Collection has an output sharpener. You click on Output Sharpener, and they make it pretty straightforward for you. What are you going to sharpen with? I'm going to sharpen with an inkjet. Viewing distance, how far is that print going to be to you? Let's say I'm going to say 1.2 to 2.5 meters. What type of paper are you using? I'm using luster paper. What is the printer resolution? So inside of here, 2880 by 1440s, which are standard Epson 3800, 3000, 7900, so they're going to be running around that. Once you have all of that stuff set, it applies the sharpening that it needs for that. And I want to click OK. That's it. The sharpening for me then is done. Now, you could do this with an Unsharp mask. You could do this with the detail slider. You could do this in a variety of different ways. But for me, I tend to just like the speed of working with that. And that's why you buy plugins. You buy plugins for speed. Now, in this case, this is pretty much ready to go. I would save this and bring this back into Lightroom. I could print out of here. I just tend to think that a lot of the times, Lightroom just makes it a lot easier for me to print. It's a preference, but you could do it. The more important part, I think, of it all is this right here. I'm gonna go to the Epson website. It's important that you understand that when you work with paper and when you work with printing, you're going to need something called an Icc profile. When you go to drivers and support, I'm gonna go to professional imaging. Under professional imaging, I'm going to find the printer that I'm looking for. So in this case, I'm going to say Epson 3880. There's the Stylus Pro 3880. You want to download the driver for the printer. Once you download the driver for the printer, in the case of Epson, they tend to have the Icc profiles installed with the driver. Now, if I go to, let's say, Red River paper, all right, Red River paper. Inside of here, go to the Red River catalog, tons of different papers here. Now, what do you need for this? Icc color profiles. You click on the Icc color profiles. Inside of here, this will bring you to, let's go to the color profiles. Right here, you find the profile. So in this case, I'm using the Epson 3880. Come over here. These are all of the papers that I would be using. So let's say that I use a Polar Pro Metallic. I click on that. This files the Icc profile that you would have to install. Once you do that, it's just a matter of going into File Print. Under the Print section, you set up where you want to print it. This is the key right here. Color handling. Photoshop handles the colors, and the print profile is dependent on the type of paper that you're using. If you do not do this one part, you will mess up your print. Guaranteed. So you have to have the Icc profile installed on the computer, and you have to match it to the type of paper that you're using. Now, there's a whole process for you to be able to do this. That's just something that I wanted to make sure that you understood, that there's output sharpening and Icc profiles. Those two things will guarantee you a much better print. If you need to see this in much greater detail, this is what I would recommend to you. Go to kelby1.com, and inside of the Kelby One, I did this entire class called Print, Pack, and Ship Your Photos Like a Pro. I did this with Dan Steinhardt. Now, Dan was the marketing manager for Epson, is now at Canon, and he goes through the process with me, and we talk about what kind of papers to select, how to print it, how to be able to organize all of the stuff to pack it and ship it. So it takes you an end-to-end process, making you look like a professional. So make sure that you keep that in mind. Now, what do we want to do from here? We have a website that I want you to watch, and this is something that I was a big fan. I just got back from New Mexico and I was doing this, and the Monroe Gallery of Photography has some of the world's best images from great photojournalists. You have Eisenstadt, you have Carl Meidens, you have Joe McNally, you have Steven Shapiro, tons of individuals providing some beautiful images. Make sure that you take a look at the Monroe Gallery of Photography. It is over at monroegallery.com. And also of a special note is that our own Joe McNally has his own showing there October 3rd. So if you're in the New Mexico area, anywhere near the New Mexico, within driving distance, 7 hours driving distance of New Mexico, October 3rd, you want to go there. You want to go. I'm flying out here from Tampa. I'm going to get there. I can't wait to see a solo show. So keep that in mind. Now, contest time. What are we going to do? I want you to go to the Kelby TV or to the Kelby One website. Once you're at the Kelby One website, go over to the More section, and under the More section, go to your webcasts. Inside of the webcast, there's tons of different shows for you to watch. The one that you want to look at right now is photography tips and tricks. Go find the episode 70. This one's 69, but it'll work for now. Inside of here, go all the way down to the bottom. At the bottom, you want to put in your name. You want to log in, put in your name, put in your email address, and leave us a comment. Tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like. Guys, this is your show. Nick, I hope this helped you out. I'd love to be able to solve any other problems for you guys. Let us know what you want to see. We're more than happy to try to help. One of you guys is going to win the Print in the Process by David Duchemin. Thanks to our friends over at Peachbit for that. So that's pretty much it. My name is RC, and we'll see you guys here next week on Photography Tips and Tricks. Take care.